It happened beneath the soft hum of jazz and the delicate clink of champagne glasses at my mother-in-law's 60th birthday party. The restaurant was lit with that expensive kind of warmth, amber light bouncing off gold-rimmed wine glasses and polished smiles. The kind of place that made everyone speak in soft, pleasant tones, as though volume itself might crack the illusion of grace. People milled around the long dining tables arranged in a U-shape, moving like they were part of some carefully choreographed scene in a movie. Handshakes, hugs, cheek kisses. I recognized half the faces and tolerated the rest. Everyone played their part so well. The perfect family look we'd mastered over the years was on full display, like a curated gallery of contentment. I was nursing my second glass of champagne, leaning against the bar with one foot on the brass rail, half listening to a cousin ramble about her upcoming wedding. She was explaining the color scheme, something about sage green and dusty rose, while showing me a Pinterest board on her phone. I nodded occasionally, my mind drifting. The jazz trio in the corner was playing a smooth rendition of Fly Me to the Moon. And every now and then, someone burst into that kind of practiced laughter that doesn't actually reach the eyes. I scanned the room and saw her, my wife, laughing along with a cluster of her aunts, her hand resting lightly on her mother's arm. Her face was animated, expressive. She was performing. We both were. It had become second nature. A waiter passed with a tray of appetizers. I reached for something skewered and vaguely gourmet, but before I could take a bite, she appeared beside me. No announcement, no smile, just there. Her perfume, familiar, floral with something sharp underneath, caught me off guard. I turned my head slightly, ready for a quick comment or a request to switch seats, but she didn't look at me. Her eyes were focused straight ahead, like she was talking to someone else entirely. I stayed with you out of pity. That was it. That was all she said. No whisper, no hesitation, no anger, just information, delivered with the same emotional weight as telling me there was traffic on the way over, or that the caterer ran out of shrimp. Her tone wasn't cruel. It wasn't even distant. It was surgical, cold, detached, and final. I stared at her, trying to make sense of it. Surely I misheard. Surely this wasn't the moment she chose. Here, in the middle of a family celebration, surrounded by people who thought we were still the strong couple. Surely there was some missing context. But her expression didn't change. She didn't blink. She just stood there for a second longer, then walked away toward the table where dessert was being set up. My hand tightened around the stem of the glass. I looked down and realized the bubbles had stopped rising. The champagne had gone flat. Just like that, I set the glass down on the nearest table, the sound of crystal on wood muffled by a linen runner. My chest felt strangely hollow, not heavy, just hollow, as if something had already been scooped out, and I was only now noticing the absence. No one else noticed. The jazz played on. Laughter rolled like background noise. Somewhere behind me, her uncle was toasting the birthday girl, raising his glass and making some joke about aging gracefully. People chuckled. Someone whistled. I didn't turn to look. I just walked. I moved past the waitstaff weaving between tables, past the sea of semi-familiar faces frozen in moments of celebration. No one called my name. No one asked where I was going. Maybe they thought I was headed to the bathroom or taking a call. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe that was the point. Outside, the night greeted me with its usual Texas weight, thick, humid, clinging to skin like a wet cloth. The sharp scent of asphalt and blooming jasmine mixed with the distant smell of barbecue from the diner across the street. I stood by the curb for a moment, letting the warm air fill my lungs, grounding myself in something other than her voice. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was something quieter, older, like an echo from a well I didn't know existed. The sentence kept looping in my head, not with rage, but with disbelief. I stayed with you out of pity. I replayed it, searching for a different inflection, a softer undertone, a hidden plea. But there was nothing, just the plain, merciless truth. Habit, history, hope. That's why I'd stayed. I knew that. There had been love, once real and messy and overwhelming. But over time, it settled into routine, then into resentment, and eventually into something even harder to name. Still, I held on, because I thought that was what people did. You don't walk away from a life you've built just because the wallpaper starts to peel. But pity? That's what she'd been carrying? That's what she thought of me? I didn't go back in. I didn't finish my drink. Didn't wait for the cake, or the speech, or the awkward drive home where we'd pretend everything was fine until we were alone in the car and the silence between us became unbearable. I didn't even text her. I just walked to the car, unlocked it, sat in the driver's seat with the door open, and stared out across the nearly empty parking lot. Inside, the party would keep going. People would cheer when they brought out the cake. There'd be candles and clapping and a heartfelt toast. My absence wouldn't register. Or if it did, someone would make excuses for me. He had a work thing. Or he stepped out for a call. She'd probably nod along, play the part, smile even, because that's what she was good at, pretending. And up until now, I'd been her co-star. But the performance was over. And I wasn't interested in the encore. Outside, the parking lot buzzed with cicadas and the flickering neon glow from the diner across the street painted everything in washed-out colors. Pale pinks, sickly yellows, and that strange kind of blue that only shows up in the quiet hours between choices. The pavement was still warm from the day's sun, and the air hung thick, sticky, like the aftermath of a storm that never came. I leaned against the car for a moment, letting the heat rise into my back, not thinking, not planning, just letting my body exist without instruction. Something inside me was unraveling slowly, like a knot I'd forgotten was there, finally loosening. I opened the trunk. The light flickered weakly above it, casting shadows over the clutter inside. Old jumper cables, a pair of torn work gloves, a blanket we used to keep in the back for road trips we hadn't taken in years. And then there it was, her suitcase, that battered blue thing she had brought with her the day she moved in, back when everything was new and urgent and full of promise. I always hated that suitcase, not because it was ugly or broken or out of place, but because she refused to replace it. She said it had history, said it still worked, but the wheels were useless, the handle stuck half the time, and the zipper was constantly getting caught. Still, she clung to it, like it was proof of something. I reached in, grabbed the handle, which of course jammed halfway, and yanked the whole thing out. It hit the edge of the trunk with a dull thud and landed on the asphalt with a scrape. I stood over it for a second, then rolled it, or dragged it, really, across the lot to her car. It felt symbolic, even if no one else would ever know. This was hers. Let her carry it now. She came out 5, maybe 10 minutes later, still wearing the same Berg *NDY dress, still glowing under the string lights that spilled out from the restaurant's patio. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement, and for a moment, it felt like I was watching a scene from a film I didn't audition for. She didn't look surprised to see me there. Not really. More like mildly inconvenienced. Like I'd skipped a step in the script and now she had to improvise. She stopped a few feet away from her car, her eyes landing on the suitcase beside it. I didn't say anything, just took a step back, giving her space, giving myself distance. The kind of silence that existed between us in that moment was new. Not hostile, not cold, just real. No performance. No obligation. Just the wide, aching truth of two people who had come to the same conclusion at wildly different speeds. "You're not even going to ask why?" she finally said. Her voice wasn't cruel, but it had that edge, the kind of sharpness people develop when they've rehearsed a moment too many times in their head. She probably expected a fight. A plea. Some dramatic last-ditch grasp at whatever we used to be. But I didn't have any of that left. "No," I said. "Not anymore." She blinked. Just once. But I saw it. The flicker. The tiny fracture in the mask she'd kept so perfectly in place all evening. I wondered if she had imagined herself walking out. Maybe in her version. She was the one who left me standing here, suitcase in hand, confused and undone. Maybe she pictured me chasing after her, begging her to explain, to stay, to love me again. But I didn't. She glanced at the suitcase again, then back at me. Her mouth opened, then closed. Like maybe she had something else to say. A last word, a final twist of the knife, but nothing came. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I owed her anything. The door to the restaurant swung open behind us. Laughter spilled out, followed by someone calling her name. She turned toward the sound instinctively, but no one saw her. The door swung shut again. The moment passed. "I guess this is it then," she said softly. I nodded. "Yeah, I guess it is." She didn't cry. She didn't break down or scream or demand I give her a reason to stay. She just stood there for a few more seconds, then reached down and picked up the handle of her suitcase. Caught as usual. She didn't even try to fix it. Just lifted the whole thing and carried it awkwardly toward the driver's side of her car. I watched her open the door, throw the suitcase into the back seat, and pause, her hand resting on the top of the car like she needed a second to decide whether or not to look back. She didn't. She got in, started the engine, and drove off without another word. The taillights faded into the distance, swallowed by the darkness beyond the parking lot. I stood there for a while longer, staring at the space her car had occupied. The air was quieter now, the cicadas louder in its absence. I could still smell her perfume faintly, like it clung to the night out of spite. Eventually, I got back into my own car. The driver's seat was still warm from earlier. I didn't turn the engine on right away. Just sat there, hands on the wheel, staring at the steering column like it might offer me an answer. But there wasn't anything left to solve. The moment had happened. The sentence had been said. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to glue anything back together. I drove back to the apartment with the windows down. Let the wind mess up my hair. Let the city lights blur past like streaks of fading memory. I didn't turn on the radio. Didn't call anyone. I didn't need to. This wasn't a story that needed telling. Not yet. By the time I reached the apartment complex, the night had settled into something deeper, quieter. I parked in our know-my spot, turned off the engine, and sat for a minute in the stillness. There was no grand realization, no cinematic swelling of music, no epiphany. Just breath, just being. The hallway lights hummed as I walked up the stairs. The door creaked open like always, sticking a little before giving way. Inside, everything looked exactly the same, but everything felt different. I locked the door behind me, not to shut her out. She was already gone. But to mark the shift, to draw a line, however invisible. And then I opened the windows, let the night air sweep in and push out the weight that had lingered too long. I didn't rage, didn't cry, didn't touch her things. I didn't even look at them. I just let myself breathe. Let myself sit in the quiet without having to explain or justify or pretend. And that silence, for the first time in years, felt like mine. Back at the apartment, the stillness was unnerving at first. Not peaceful, not yet. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against your chest, like walking into a room where something had just happened. Not violence, not grief. Something subtler. Something like truth. The furniture sat exactly where we left it that morning. Her coffee mug was still in the sink. The blanket we argued about, the one I said we didn't need and she insisted gave the couch texture, was folded with surgical precision across the backrest. Nothing had changed, and yet, everything had. I didn't flick on the overhead light. I let the glow from the street lamps seep through the windows and spill across the floor in long, fractured shadows. The city hummed outside, low and steady, like background noise meant to keep me tethered. I moved through the space slowly, as if it belonged to someone else. As if I was a guest in a life that had shifted without warning. The urge to erase her was there, fleeting but sharp, to tear through the apartment and remove every trace. But I didn't touch a thing. Not out of sentiment, out of clarity. This wasn't about erasing her. This was about finding myself again, underneath all the layers I'd built just to survive the years we'd spent drifting side by side. I went to the bedroom and stood in the doorway. The bed was made perfectly. Of course it was. She always made it like we had company coming, even when we didn't. I didn't unmake it. I pulled off the pillows from my side, sat down at the edge, and just existed. The air was cool from the breeze coming through the windows. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed faintly, A dog barked in response, and the moment passed without demanding anything from me. The apartment, our home, had always been tense. Not in the dramatic way people imagine. Not in screaming matches or broken dishes. No, our tension was the kind that came from too many silences, too many swallowed truths. A minefield of unsaid things. You never knew when a question would be the wrong one, when a sigh would be misread, when eye contact would feel more like a threat than a connection. But now the air felt still in a way I hadn't expected. Not empty, not echoing, solid. For the first time, the floor didn't feel like it might collapse under my next step. I walked into the bathroom, washed my face, and caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked like someone who had just survived something. Not in the obvious way. There were no bruises or broken pieces. Just a rawness around the eyes, a looseness in the shoulders. Like something had been lifted, or maybe let go. She hadn't taken anything. I noticed that almost immediately. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her shoes lined up in perfect rows. Her perfume bottles still crowding the edge of the dresser. Her side of the sink, with all the little containers and label jars, was untouched. It told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't spontaneous. It was a strategy. She hadn't walked away. She had floated just far enough to see if I would chase her. I didn't. I walked out to the balcony, sat on the cheap folding chair we never upgraded, and looked out over the city. The buildings glowed quietly, like they were keeping secrets. It was a view we had loved once. I remember when we first moved in, how we stood out there with takeout boxes and talked about what life would look like when we got settled. We never did, not really. We just filled the space with routines and calendar reminders and the occasional apology that didn't fix anything. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was grieving, that would come later if at all, but because I was adjusting to the shift. The silence didn't feel empty anymore, felt earned. The next morning, I woke up before the sun rose. Made coffee, black, no cinnamon oat creamer. She always insisted on it, even though it made the coffee taste like melted dessert. I stood in the kitchen, sipping from the same chipped mug I'd used since college, and watched the sky change color. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel broken. I felt awake. And that was enough. The day passed in small, deliberate movements. I didn't tell anyone. Not my brother, not my coworkers, not even my best friend from college who would have dropped everything to fly in and stage an intervention. There was something sacred about holding it close for now. About not letting anyone else write the next chapter too soon. I took out a notebook from the junk drawer, one of those free ones we got from some conference, and sat at the dining table. I didn't write a manifesto or a letter, just made a list. Things I wanted to do, books I'd bought but never read, places I wanted to see, people I wanted to talk to again, without feeling like I had to hide parts of myself. I didn't know what the future looked like. I didn't care. I had space now, time, breath, and no one standing beside me with a measuring stick, ready to point out how I came up short. By evening, the apartment felt different. Still the same furniture, still the same walls, but the energy had shifted. It was mine now, not shared, not borrowed, mine, and it didn't feel like loss. Felt like beginning. It wasn't until a week later that the whispers started to reach me. Small-town silence never lasts. A mutual friend, someone who couldn't resist passing along the latest, mentioned that she hadn't gone to her sister's place like she claimed. She'd gone to Flagstaff. And she hadn't gone alone. He was from her old job, the quiet tech guy, the one she once called harmless. I remembered him vaguely, always in the background of company parties, always standing a little too close. She'd laughed off the idea that there was anything there, said he was just a friend, said he had a girlfriend, said I was being paranoid. Now they were sharing an Airbnb. It didn't hit like a betrayal. It hit like confirmation. She hadn't just left. She'd planned the landing. She stayed just long enough to keep her story clean. Long enough to look like the one who was holding it together. Long enough to pretend she was the selfless one. In her version, she was the woman who could have walked away but didn't. The noble sufferer. The saint who stayed out of pity. Until I held the door open first. That shift. That tiny choice to leave before I was left. changed everything. She didn't get the ending she wanted. She didn't get to be the one who outgrew me, who staged her clean escape into someone else's arms. I didn't rage. I didn't spiral. I didn't even reach out. I just moved on. And that was the most unexpected thing I could have done. And then came Vanessa. She texted me on a Sunday. Casual, unexpected, like someone testing the weight of a door they hadn't opened in years. Vanessa had been my manager years ago, back when I was trying to climb my way out of corporate anonymity. She always saw something in me I hadn't yet learned to trust. Now she was in Austin, building something new, and wanted a partner. Not just business, but someone who understood what it meant to start from nothing. Our first coffee was meant to catch up, turned into 3 hours of unfiltered conversation. We didn't flirt. We built. We didn't reminisce. We mapped the future. There was no rush, no grand declarations, just quiet understanding, shared ambition, and a sense that we'd both been burned the same way, and still chose to build something out of the ashes. She hadn't read the fine print, my ex. The business Vanessa and I started together, legally mine. The equity, already transferred months ago, while she thought I was still the man who waited for her to come home late. The lawyers never called her. They called me. When the dust settled, she had a rented condo in Arizona, a relationship already cracking, and a series of unanswered emails she kept sending in the hopes that maybe I'd still be the man she could manipulate. But I wasn't. Not anymore. Not out of spite. Out of peace. She used to warn me she might leave, that one day I'd push her too far. But when she finally did, she wasn't the one walking away with power. She thought she was abandoning me, but I was the one who let go.